October 1945. The processing facility on the outskirts of the American occupation zone smelled of canvas and disinfectant, and the particular institutional neutrality of a place that had been organized by people who believed that organization was itself a form of care. Japanese women officers, nursing corps commanders, administrative staff, the senior female personnel of an imperial military establishment that had consumed their professional lives with the absolute thoroughness of a system that recognized no boundary between the individual and her duty, moved through the intake procedure with the contained posture of women who had survived the collapse of everything they had been trained to serve and were now navigating the aftermath with the only tool the collapse had left them, the discipline that the institution had given them before it ceased to exist. They had expected many things from American custody. They had been prepared by years of wartime instruction for most of the worst of them. What they had not been prepared for, what no briefing, no propaganda, no carefully constructed portrait of the American enemy had thought to address, was a folded white towel and a bar of soap placed on a wooden bench beside a curtained washing area, with a gesture from an American female auxiliary toward the privacy within, and the unmistakable implication that the time and the attire and the dignity of cleaning oneself were being offered, without condition, as a matter of course. They stood and looked at the soap, and the soap, in its ordinariness, in its clean and uncomplicated existence on the bench, undid something that the bombs and the surrender and the weeks of displacement had not. If you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that the history books leave out, and we find them every single week. To understand the weight of that moment, one must understand what the bodies of these women had endured in the war's final year. By 1944 and in 1945, the Imperial military's logistical system had been so comprehensively dismantled by American air and naval interdiction that the basic provisions of human existence, food, clean water, medical supplies, had become genuinely scarce across every theater of Japanese military operations. Soap was not a priority. Soap did not appear in the emergency allocation tables of a military establishment rationing aviation fuel and artillery shells and the caloric intake of fighting men. The nursing corps officers who had served in field hospitals across the Pacific and Southeast Asia had spent the war's final months in conditions of hygiene so degraded that the medical personnel among them understood, with the clinical clarity of their training, the precise relationship between what they were living in and the infections and diseases that were killing their patients at rates that adequate sanitation would have reduced. They had endured this not because they did not understand what cleanliness required, but because the system that was supposed to provide it had nothing left to give. The American military's approach to personal hygiene was, by contrast, a logistical priority rather than a luxury. The lessons of earlier wars, of the Civil War, of the First World War, of the early Pacific campaigns where disease had killed more men than combat in several theaters, had been absorbed into American military medical doctrine with the systematic thoroughness of an institution that measured its effectiveness in the health statistics of its personnel as well as in its tactical outcomes. Soap, clean water, sanitation facilities. These were not amenities appended to the American military supply chain when resources permitted. They were components of combat effectiveness, resourced and prioritized accordingly, present in American facilities as reliably as ammunition and fuel because the institutional calculation had determined, on the basis of documented evidence, that they were equally essential to the mission. The bar of soap on the bench was not a gesture of generosity. It was a standard issue item, present because the system that produced it had never been broken, never been rationed into absence, never been forced to choose between hygiene and survival in the way that Japan's collapsing logistics had forced that choice for years. The women officers who encountered it did not immediately know this. What they knew was the soap itself, its smell, its texture, the evidence it carried of a manufacturing and distribution system that could produce it in sufficient quantities to place it, without apparent significance, in the intake area of an occupation processing facility as though its presence required no explanation. For women who had been living without it, in conditions whose degradation their professional training had equipped them to understand precisely. The soap was not a small thing. It was an argument made in the most direct possible medium, not in language, not in ideology, not in the abstractions of political philosophy, but in the physical reality of a clean object placed within reach of hands that had been a long time without one. The female American auxiliary personnel who administered the intake procedure had been briefed by the occupation authorities' administrative guidance to conduct the processing of Japanese female detainees with a professional courtesy extended to any person in the custody of American military administration. The guidance was practical and specific, provide standard hygiene provisions, explain procedures through interpreters where available, maintain the baseline of dignified treatment that American military regulations required for persons in custody. The women carrying out this guidance were not, for the most part, consciously engaged in an act of ideological communication. They were doing their jobs efficiently, without ceremony, with the matter-of-fact competence of people who had been trained to a standard and were meeting it. It was precisely this absence of ceremony that carried the deepest informational content. The soap was not presented as a gift. The towel was not offered with the expectation of gratitude. They were simply there, as they would have been for anyone, because the system that placed them there did not make exceptions based on the identity of the person receiving them. Japanese women officers of the Imperial military had occupied a position of extraordinary contradiction within the institutional structure they served. They had held rank, exercised authority, and demonstrated professional competence in roles, particularly in the nursing corps and medical administration, that required education, leadership, and sustained performance under conditions of extreme difficulty. They had done this within a system that simultaneously demanded their total subordination to its purposes and offered them, in exchange for that subordination, a form of institutional identity that the broader culture of Imperial Japan did not otherwise make available to women. The contradiction had been managed, for the duration of the war, by the absolute totality of the institution's claims on their lives, by the fact that the system's demands left no space in which the contradiction could be examined, because examination required a stillness and a distance from institutional obligation that wartime did not permit. The processing facility provided, involuntarily, exactly that distance. The institution was gone. Its demands had ceased. The identity it had offered in exchange for total subordination was no longer available because the institution that had issued it no longer existed in any operative sense. What remained were the women themselves, their professional competence, their physical exhaustion, their accumulated experience, and the particular vulnerability of people whose organizing framework has been removed and who have not yet found or constructed what will replace it. Into this vulnerability, the American processing system placed soap, a towel, clean water, and the curtained privacy to use them. The accounts of what happened in the moments after the women understood what was being offered vary in their detail, but converge in their substance. Some women wept and could not immediately explain why. Some stood for a long moment before moving, as though the permission required more verification than a single gesture could supply. Some, the nurses among them, particularly, moved with a professional directness that reflected the clinical understanding of what hygiene meant and the determination to restore it as quickly as the opportunity allowed. What the accounts share is the description of an aftermath, of women who emerged from the washing area, changed in a way that the physical act of cleaning alone did not fully account for. Something had been restored that was not only the body's cleanliness. Something had been acknowledged that was not only the practical need for sanitation. What had been acknowledged, though no one in the facility had intended it as acknowledgement, was personhood. The soap and the towel said, in the language of provision rather than proclamation, that the person receiving them had a body that mattered, not as an instrument of the state's purposes, not as a vehicle for the performance of duty, but as a human body, entitled by its mere existence to the basic provisions of dignity. This was not the language of Imperial Japan's institutional culture, which had organized the bodies of its military women entirely around their functional value to the institution. It was the language of a different set of assumptions, assumptions that the American military had encoded imperfectly and inconsistently, but recognizably, into the baseline of its treatment of persons in its custody. The transformation this produced was not immediate and it was not universal. Human beings do not revise foundational beliefs in response to a single bar of soap. The women officers who passed through the processing facility carried with them the full weight of their formation, the years of training, the ideological commitment, the professional identity that the Imperial institution had built in them through the most demanding period of their lives. That weight did not dissolve in a washing area, but something shifted in its relationship to the women carrying it. The certainty that the enemy was what the ideology had said he was, brutal, contemptuous, indifferent to the humanity of those he defeated, had encountered evidence of a quality that evidence of that kind always carries. The quality of being undeniable, because it had been experienced rather than reported, because it lived now in the body's memory rather than in the mind's inventory of things that had been heard and filed. The chocolate bar that other women in other camps had encountered in those same weeks carried its familiar argument about abundance. The English lesson had carried its argument about possibility. The soap carried something different, and in some ways more fundamental than either. An argument about the baseline of human worth that preceded both abundance and possibility, that did not require a nation to be rich or an institution to be enlightened, that required only the decision, made and maintained, that the person before you is a person, and that persons, by their nature, deserve to be clean. It was a small argument. It was made with the most ordinary of objects. And it was for the women who received it in that processing facility in October 1945, one of the most quietly devastating things the war had left behind. If this story reached something in you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you have not already. The smallest moments of history are sometimes the ones that explain everything. We will keep finding them.